Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Chinophile, and this is a response to AronRa's response to claims that bestiality can be moral. Um, you're probably not aware of this, but I recently called into the Magic Sandwich Show, which is a great secular podcast with lots of interesting conversation, and I'm sure that if you enjoy good intellectual conversation, you'll like this show. Well, I called in to essentially argue in favor of bestiality being morally permissible. But I found that I didn't really have to make the argument. The host of the show, DPR Jones, essentially made my counter argument for me, which is that sexual relationships between human beings and other animals are certainly no worse than many of the things we do to them, and so it would be hypocritical of us to forbid the one while allowing the other. That's not a good argument at all, but it is a nice little counter-argument to the idea that somehow sexuality should be raised onto some pedestal, and all things related to it should be held to a higher standard than most of our daily activities. Uh, this video isn't really about the Magic Sandwich Show, although I'm going to include a link to it. I think my call starts at around an hour 45, if I remember correctly. It's pretty late in there. Anyway, my response is basically focused on one comment that AronRa seems to like to make when it comes to this topic, and frankly, I agree with him, but I come to different conclusions, of course. And his response is basically that in order for a sexual relationship between two parties to be healthy, the two parties have to be equals. I agree with him for the most part, but there are a couple of semantic things that I need to go over before I explain why I think that in terms of sexual relationships, animals and human beings, at least certain kinds of animals, can claim a sort of limited equality in that particular realm. He said this on Magic Sandwich number 51, and also on another show in October of 2011. So I'll include links to both, and if you want to get some idea of where the conversation on this show on this topic has gone so far, I urge you to look into it. But first, about equality. I'm a mathematician by training, so I love semantic arguments, and this may be a little dry for most of you, so you can probably skip to around 5 or 6 minutes in if you don't want to hear it. But there's a difference between equality and equivalence. Now, equality, in a mathematical sense, means that two things are identical, that all the properties of one are the same as the properties of the other, and vice versa. That's not what most people mean when they say that two things are equal in this context. What they mean generally is that the similarities are so much more important than the differences that we can effectively ignore the differences. And that's fine, but mathematically that maps to a different concept called equivalence, where you define an equivalence relation by saying two things are considered to be the same if they meet these criteria. For example, in topology, two objects would be considered the same if, for example, you could continuously deform one into the other. But that's getting a little technical. The main difference, and the reason why I'm making this distinction, is that equality, at its most basic level, is very strict. Everything has to be the same about these two individuals. I don't think that that's what people actually mean by it. I think people mean equivalence, but they're unwilling to spell out the obvious equivalence between men and women. So, before I continue, I should say that I think that in every way that matters to a civilized society, men and women should be treated equally. There are small differences in brain structure and body type and whatnot, but who cares? These differences pale in comparison to the vast number of similarities between the two genders, and thus they should be treated equally when it comes to, say, job performance or aptitudes as a parent, or what have you. But I don't think that equality is the right word for what we want in sexual relationships. What we want in any relationship with a human being, really. Take, for example, the relationship between my grandparents. They love each other very much, and they've been married for decades, so they know how this thing works. But I'm not going to call them equal just because we should treat them equally. My grandfather is socially awkward and aloof and quiet, and my grandmother is very kind and sweet and gregarious. So they aren't equal, really. What they are, and this is where the magic happens, is complementary to each other. And yes, I know there's a Christian doctrine, complementarianism, which says that men and women aren't equal because they fulfill complementary roles in marriage. I disagree with that, but that's not where I'm going with this. In healthy relationships, what works isn't equality, but complementarity. The phrase opposite attracts is an approximation of this, albeit a bad one. Two people with the same strengths and weaknesses in a relationship will only amplify those same strengths and weaknesses, and won't get anything new from the relationship. But if they complement each other, then the relationship can be beneficial to both parties. Then they can sort of even each other out. So the question before us is this. Can interspecies relationships be complementary in the same way as healthy intraspecies relationships can? The answer, I think, is yes. So let me explain how I'm defining my equivalence relation between sexual partners so that I'm as unambiguous as possible. Equivalence in sexual relationships, the way I'm defining it, and you can supply your own definitions as you like, must have the following three components. Both parties need to be able to A. Have sexual desires of their own, B. Be able to communicate unambiguously both the presence and the absence of sexual desire to their partner, and C. Be able to detect the presence or absence of sexual desire or complicating factors in their partner and react accordingly. I'm sure there are more criteria that I'm missing and somebody is going to correct me on this, and I'll be happy to make a correction video stating essentially either why I think that my previous definition was inaccurate or why I think that my definition still stands. But those are the bare minimum when it comes to sexual relationships being practiced in a healthy manner. And all three of them, it seems, are present in species besides human beings, especially social species like dogs and horses and pigs and those kinds. Sexual desire is the obvious one. I mean, animals wouldn't have sex unless they had some drive within them to do so. Although whether they actually experience pleasure from the experience is up to debate and depends on the species. We see in many social animals that they have very clear mating rituals in which they communicate sexual desire to their desired partner. And whether it's through pheromones or through body language or any number of other ways, they can also communicate whether they're receptive to these sexual advances. Now, since human beings and other animals are capable of recognizing those signs in sexual relationships between members of the same species, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to recognize those same signs between members of different species, especially human beings. Now, one might argue that that is a form of inequality, and I'd be willing to concede that, but I still think that the sexual aspect of relationships between human beings and animals can be given an equal footing if the human being and the animal learn how to communicate with one another, which they're clearly capable of doing. I mean, if you've ever had a dog, and I don't mean had in the biblical sense, then you probably know when it is they're hungry and when they need to go out and when they want to play and that sort of thing. All of these very basic desires and impulses that they have and can clearly communicate to you. If you educate yourself a little more on animal behavior, you can get a whole wealth of information on what different animal behaviors mean and how to react to them. Why should sex be any different? There's no reason to think that other animals can't want to engage in sexual relationships with human beings, and there's no reason to stop it if both partners are willing. Now, if one of them is unwilling, then an examination of the physical or psychological trauma to the animal should bear that out. But, absent that, I don't see a problem with it. So, I'm not going to be arrogant enough to issue a challenge to AronRa because he would destroy me. Let's face it. But I am going to ask a question. It'd be nice if he answered. He doesn't have to at all, but oh well. In what sense are animals of other species, particularly dogs, because they are the main socialized, domesticated species on the planet, how is it that they in particular and human beings are unequal in such a way as to preclude any possibility of a consensual sexual relationship between members of both species, of them and of human beings? Put another way, why do you think that these animals and human beings aren't equal in enough ways that sexuality can essentially be inferred to occur between them? Well, I think that's all I have to say for now. I'll include a link to the Magic Sandwich Show, and I hope I get a response, but I'm not holding my breath on that. So, this is the Erudite Kind of File, signing off.